It was a bright Monday morning in downtown Chicago when Officer James Mitchell began his patrol shift. Having recently transferred from a smaller precinct in the suburbs, he was eager to prove himself in the bustling city streets of the 47th Precinct. The summer heat was already building, making his crisp blue uniform stick uncomfortably to his back as he drove his patrol car down Michigan Avenue. Mitchell had been on the force for 5 years, but this new assignment made him feel like a rookie all over again. His previous precinct had been predominantly white, and he hadn't dealt much with the diverse population that characterized his new beat. Some of his old colleagues had warned him about working in the city, filling his head with stereotypes and prejudices he didn't even realize he was carrying. As he cruised past the gleaming office buildings, Mitchell noticed a black BMW making a turn without properly signaling. The car was pristine, its dark paint reflecting the morning sun like polished obsidian. Something about the luxury vehicle in this part of town made Mitchell suspicious, though he couldn't exactly explain why. Flicking on his patrol lights, Mitchell pulled up behind the BMW. The driver immediately signaled and pulled over smoothly, showing clear familiarity with proper traffic stop procedures. Through his rearview mirror, Mitchell observed the driver's calm demeanor as he reached for what Mitchell assumed would be his license and registration. Approaching the vehicle, Mitchell noticed the driver was a black man in his early 50s, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit. A subtle gold tie pin caught the sunlight, and his cufflinks looked expensive. The man's appearance somehow made Mitchell even more suspicious rather than putting him at ease. "License and registration," Mitchell demanded, his tone sharper than necessary. His hand rested instinctively on his holster, though there was absolutely no indication of threat. The driver responded with dignified composure, "Of course, officer." His voice was deep and well-modulated, carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of leadership. He reached slowly for his glove compartment, maintaining visible hands throughout the movement. "I believe I know what this is about," the man continued, producing his documents with practiced ease. "The turn signal at the last intersection. I'd apologize if it wasn't visible enough. I did attempt to signal, though perhaps not as early as I should have." Mitchell snatched the documents from the man's extended hand, not bothering to acknowledge the polite explanation. The license identified the driver as Marcus Thompson, with an address in one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. Something about Thompson's composed demeanor and obvious wealth sparked an irrational irritation in Mitchell. "You people think you can just drive around in fancy cars and ignore traffic laws," Mitchell muttered, loud enough for Thompson to hear. The words came out before he could stop them, carrying years of inherited prejudices he'd never confronted. Thompson's expression remained neutral, but his eyes met Mitchell's in the side mirror, holding his gaze for a moment too long. "Excuse me, officer. What do you mean by you people?" Instead of backing down or correcting himself, Mitchell doubled down. "Listen, I don't care what kind of car you drive or what fancy suit you're wearing. Rules are rules." He began writing not just one ticket, but 3, for the turn signal, for what he claimed was excessive window tinting, though it was clearly within legal limits, and for a supposedly obstructed license plate that was perfectly visible. As Mitchell aggressively scribbled on his ticket pad, Thompson spoke again, his voice still measured but carrying a hint of something Mitchell couldn't quite identify. "Officer Mitchell," he said, reading the name tag. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor about this interaction." "File a complaint if you want," Mitchell scoffed, thrusting the citations through the window. "We both know how that'll go." Thompson carefully took the tickets, folded them precisely, and placed them in his suit pocket. "Indeed we do, Officer Mitchell. Indeed we do." There was something in his tone that should have warned Mitchell, but the officer was too caught up in his own authority to notice. As Mitchell walked back to his patrol car, he felt satisfied with himself, convinced he'd shown some rich guy that money couldn't buy exemption from the law. He had no idea that this traffic stop would soon turn his entire career upside down, or that Marcus Thompson was far more than he appeared to be. The BMW pulled away smoothly, disappearing into the morning traffic, while Mitchell resumed his patrol, already forgetting about the encounter that would come back to haunt him in just 2 weeks' time. The next 2 weeks passed normally for Officer Mitchell. He continued his regular patrols, handed out tickets, and gradually settled into his new precinct's routines. The incident with the black BMW had become just another blur in his daily duties, though he'd mentioned it a few times to his partner, Officer Sarah Rodriguez, bragging about how he put some rich guy in his place. Rodriguez, a 10-year veteran of the force, often seemed uncomfortable with Mitchell's attitudes but chose to stay quiet. She'd seen officers like him before, transfers from suburban precincts who brought their prejudices to the city streets. Usually, they either learned and adapted or transferred back out within a year. On a particularly busy Thursday afternoon, Mitchell was filling out paperwork at his desk when the precinct secretary approached with an official-looking envelope. "Officer Mitchell," she said, her expression unusually serious, "this just came for you. It's from the district court." Mitchell tore open the envelope, his confident smirk fading as he read the contents. It was a summons to appear in court regarding the citations he'd issued to Marcus Thompson. The hearing was scheduled for the following morning at 9 a.m. sharp. "Something wrong?" Rodriguez asked, noticing his change in expression. "Nah, just that BMW guy from 2 weeks ago challenging his tickets," Mitchell replied, trying to sound casual. "Probably thinks his expensive lawyer can get him out of it. Well, I've got all my documentation right here." He patted his meticulously kept logbook, where he'd recorded his version of events. That evening, Mitchell spent extra time preparing his uniform and reviewing his notes. He'd been to traffic court dozens of times and had never lost a case. In his mind, it would be routine, his word against some entitled civilians' complaints. The next morning, Mitchell arrived at the courthouse early, dressed in his best uniform with every button polished. As he walked toward the designated courtroom, he noticed something odd. Several high-ranking police officials were gathered in the hallway, including Captain Wilson, his direct supervisor, and even the precinct commander. "What's going on?" Mitchell whispered to Rodriguez, who'd come to support him. "Why are all the brass here for a simple traffic hearing?" Rodriguez shook her head, looking increasingly worried. "I don't know, but something feels off about this." When they entered courtroom 3B, Mitchell's confidence began to crack. The room was unusually full for a traffic case. He recognized several internal affairs officers seated in the gallery, their expressions stern and focused. Captain Wilson approached Mitchell before the proceedings began. "Mitchell," he said quietly, "is there anything you want to tell me about this traffic stop before we start?" "Sir," Mitchell replied, confused. "It was a routine stop. Driver failed to signal, showed attitude, so I wrote him up. Nothing special about it." Wilson's face tightened. "We'll see about that," he muttered, walking away. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Eleanor Martinez took her seat. Mitchell stood at attention, still believing he could handle whatever came his way. This hearing concerned citations issued by Officer James Mitchell to Marcus Thompson on June 15th, the judge announced. "Is the citing officer present?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mitchell responded confidently. "And Mr. Thompson?" "Present, Your Honor." Mitchell's blood ran cold as he turned to see Marcus Thompson walking to the front of the courtroom. Gone was the simple businessman in a suit. Thompson now wore the formal uniform of a police inspector, complete with badges of rank that outshone anything Mitchell had ever earned. The room fell silent as Inspector Thompson approached the bench. He carried a thick folder and what looked like a USB drive. "Your Honor," Thompson began, his voice carrying the same quiet authority Mitchell remembered from the traffic stop. "I'm Inspector Marcus Thompson, recently appointed head of internal affairs for the 47th Precinct. The citations issued to me were part of an ongoing investigation into discriminatory policing practices in our district." Mitchell felt the floor sway beneath his feet. His partner grabbed his arm to steady him as the realization hit. He hadn't pulled over some random civilian that day. He profiled, insulted, and wrongly cited his new internal affairs inspector. As Thompson began setting up video evidence from both his car's dashboard camera and his personal recording device, Mitchell saw his career flash before his eyes. The proud smirk he'd worn walking into court had vanished, replaced by the sickening knowledge that his own prejudices and abuse of authority had finally caught up with him. The courtroom fell into complete silence as Inspector Thompson began presenting his evidence. The first item was the dashboard camera footage, which played on a large screen for everyone to see. Mitchell's words from that day echoed through the speakers, each discriminatory comment, an aggressive tone, making him sink lower in his seat. "Your Honor," Thompson began, his voice steady and professional, "I'd like to draw attention to Officer Mitchell's immediate behavior upon approaching my vehicle. He played the footage again, highlighting Mitchell's hand placement on his weapon despite no signs of threat. Mitchell watched himself on screen, seeing his actions through new eyes. His unnecessary aggression, the sneering tone, the way he'd deliberately written extra citations, that all looked far worse from this perspective. Several of his fellow officers in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Furthermore, Thompson continued, "I'd like to present evidence of the actual citations issued." He projected images of the tickets onto the screen. "As you can see, the window tinting citation was completely unfounded, as my vehicle's tinting is well within legal limits, documented here by the manufacturer's certification." He held up official documentation. The allegedly obstructed license plate was, as video evidence shows, perfectly visible and properly mounted. Judge Martinez studied the evidence carefully, occasionally glancing at Mitchell, who was now visibly sweating. Captain Wilson sat with his head in his hands, clearly distressed by what he was witnessing. "Officer Mitchell," the judge addressed him directly, "would you like to explain your actions on that day?" Mitchell stood on shaky legs. "Your Honor," he paused, searching for words that wouldn't come. How could he explain decisions that now seemed so clearly wrong? "I was following standard procedure for traffic violations," he finally managed to say. "Standard procedure?" Inspector Thompson interjected. "Is it standard procedure in this precinct to use phrases like 'you people' when addressing civilians? Is it procedure to issue multiple unfounded citations as a form of harassment?" The question hung in the air like a heavy weight. Mitchell's face flushed red as he remembered his exact words that day. Several gasps came from the gallery as the racial undertones of his comments became clear. Thompson walked closer to Mitchell's position. "Officer, I wasn't just randomly driving through your patrol area that day. Over the past 3 months, we've received 17 complaints about discriminatory treatment during traffic stops in your sector. My presence was part of a broader investigation into these incidents." Mitchell felt his world spinning. Not only had he harassed an inspector, but he walked right into an ongoing investigation. His partner, Rodriguez, touched his arm supportively, but he could see the disappointment in her eyes. "Your Honor," Thompson continued, "I'd like to present additional evidence." He opened the thick folder he'd brought, revealing printed copies of civilian complaints, statistical analyses of Mitchell's traffic stops, and patterns of behavior that painted a damning picture. The data showed that Mitchell had disproportionately stopped and ticketed minorities, used more aggressive language in these encounters, and issued multiple citations far more frequently to non-white drivers. Each piece of evidence was like another nail in the coffin of his career. "Officer Mitchell," Judge Martinez spoke, her voice stern but not unkind. "Do you understand the seriousness of what's being presented here?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mitchell replied quietly, finally beginning to grasp the full magnitude of his actions. "Inspector Thompson," the judge turned to address him, "what are your recommendations in this matter?" The courtroom tensed, waiting for Thompson's response. Everyone knew he had the power to end Mitchell's career right there. Mitchell closed his eyes, preparing for the worst. "Your Honor," Thompson began, surprising everyone with his measured tone, while Officer Mitchell's actions were clearly inappropriate and discriminatory. "I believe this presents an opportunity for meaningful change rather than just punishment." Mitchell's eyes snapped open, staring at Thompson in disbelief. The inspector continued, "I am proposing a comprehensive reform program, starting with Officer Mitchell's case. However, before we discuss those recommendations, I believe we need to address the immediate violations presented today." As Thompson began outlining his proposed course of action, Mitchell realized this wasn't just about the traffic stop anymore. This was about to become a turning point, not just for him, but potentially for the entire precinct. The question was, would he be made an example of, or would he become part of the solution? Inspector Thompson stood before the court with a presence that commanded attention. "Your Honor," he began, "I recommend a 3-pronged approach to address Officer Mitchell's conduct." He opened another folder while Mitchell held his breath, awaiting his fate. "First," Thompson continued, "the immediate citations issued to me during the traffic stop should be dismissed as they were clearly unfounded and motivated by bias." Judge Martinez nodded in agreement, making a note in her records. The tension in the courtroom shifted slightly. Many had expected Thompson to demand Mitchell's badge, But the inspector was taking a different approach. Captain Wilson leaned forward, listening intently as Thompson continued. Finally, upon completion of the training, Officer Mitchell will be reassigned to community outreach under my direct supervision for a probationary period of 6 months. Thompson's voice carried authority, but also held a note of hope. During this time, you will work directly with the communities he has previously shown bias against. Judge Martinez considered the recommendations carefully. Officer Mitchell, she addressed him directly. Do you understand that Inspector Thompson is offering you an opportunity for redemption rather than termination? Mitchell stood, his voice shaky but clear. Yes, Your Honor. I do. Would you like to address the court regarding your actions? Mitchell looked around the courtroom, seeing the faces of his fellow officers, his partner Rodriguez, Captain Wilson, and finally Inspector Thompson. The weight of his actions and their consequences finally hit him fully. Your Honor, he began, his voice cracking slightly. I never thought of myself as prejudiced. Where I worked before, things were different. But standing here today, seeing myself on that video, hearing my own words. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I was wrong. Not just about Inspector Thompson, but about how I've been approaching my job. I've been carrying biases I didn't even recognize, and I've been using my badge as a weapon instead of a symbol of protection and service. The courtroom remained silent as Mitchell continued. I would like to accept Inspector Thompson's recommendations. I want to learn from this. I want to be better. His words, though simple, carried genuine remorse and determination. Thompson nodded slightly, acknowledging Mitchell's sincerity. He then addressed the court again. Your Honor, there's one more aspect to consider. This case isn't just about Officer Mitchell. It's about systemic issues within our department that need addressing. He produced more documentation, this time showing broader patterns across the precinct. Officer Mitchell's actions, while serious, are symptoms of a larger problem. I'm proposing that his rehabilitation program serve as a pilot for department-wide reforms. Captain Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Thompson outlined statistics showing similar patterns of bias across multiple officers and shifts. The inspector's investigation had uncovered not just individual incidents, but a cultural problem that needed addressing. Judge Martinez reviewed all the evidence and recommendations before making her ruling. Based on the evidence presented and Inspector Thompson's recommendations, this court rules as follows. The room fell silent as she continued. All citations issued during the traffic stop in question are hereby dismissed. Officer James Mitchell will serve a 30-day suspension without pay, during which he must complete the prescribed sensitivity and anti-bias training program. She paused, looking directly at Mitchell. Upon successful completion of the training, Officer Mitchell will serve 6 months of probation under Inspector Thompson's supervision in community outreach. Monthly progress reports will be required. Mitchell nodded, accepting the ruling with visible relief that he still had a chance to keep his badge. Furthermore, the judge added, I am ordering a full review of the precinct's traffic stop procedures and bias training programs to be overseen by Inspector Thompson's office. As the judge's gavel fell, Mitchell felt a strange mixture of shame and hope. He had avoided losing his job, but the real work was just beginning. He watched as Inspector Thompson gathered his materials, wondering how the man he had so casually discriminated against had become the architect of his possible redemption. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Rodriguez approached Mitchell. You got lucky, she said quietly. Inspector Thompson could have ended your career today. Don't waste this chance. Mitchell nodded, watching Thompson's retreating figure. Tomorrow would begin his journey toward becoming not just a better officer, but a better person. The real question was he ready for the challenging path ahead? The first day of Mitchell's sensitivity training arrived 1 week after the court hearing. He sat in a small classroom at the police academy, joined by 5 other officers who had been flagged for similar infractions. The room was quiet, filled with a mixture of resentment and resignation. Inspector Thompson walked in precisely at 8 a.m., carrying a laptop and several folders. He had traded his formal uniform for business casual attire, but his authoritative presence remained unchanged. Behind him came Dr. Sarah Chen, a renowned expert in police psychology and community relations. Good morning, officers, Thompson began, surveying the room. You're here because each of you has demonstrated behaviors that harm both our community and our department's reputation. But more importantly, you're here because we believe you can do better. Mitchell found himself paying close attention, surprised by Thompson's tone. There was no hint of the hostility or revenge he had expected. Instead, the inspector spoke with genuine concern for both the officers and the community they served. Dr. Chen stepped forward, writing on the whiteboard. Day 1. Understanding our biases. She turned to face the class. Before we begin, I want each of you to share the incident that brought you here. Officer Mitchell, would you like to start? Mitchell felt all eyes turned to him. Taking a deep breath, he recounted the traffic stop, this time focusing on his actions rather than justifications. As he spoke, Dr. Chen noted key phrases and behaviors on the board. Thank you for your honesty, she said when he finished. Now let's break down what happened that day, not to shame you, but to understand the thought patterns that led to those actions. Over the next 3 hours, they analyzed each decision point in Mitchell's encounter with Thompson. Why did he immediately rest his hand on his weapon? Why did the sight of an expensive car with a black driver trigger suspicion? What assumptions had he made before even speaking to Thompson? During the lunch break, Mitchell sat alone, processing the morning's discussions. To his surprise, Inspector Thompson joined him with his own sandwich. Officer Mitchell, Thompson said, settling into the chair across from him. How are you finding the session so far? Mitchell considered the question carefully. Uncomfortable, he admitted. But maybe that's the point. Thompson nodded, unwrapping his sandwich. Growth rarely comes from comfort. You know, when I first started as a rookie 30 years ago, I faced officers like the person you were that day. Some of them never changed. Others became my greatest allies in reforming the department. Sir, Mitchell began hesitantly, I have to ask. Why did you give me this chance? You could have ended my career that day in court. Thompson put down his sandwich, his expression serious. Because firing you would have been easy. Making real change is harder. When I saw you in court, watching that video of yourself, I recognized something, the moment someone first sees their own prejudices clearly. I've been through that moment myself, though from the other side. The afternoon session focused on real-world scenarios. Dr. Chen presented body camera footage from various police encounters, having the officers analyze the interactions and suggest alternative approaches. During one particular video showing a tense situation that ended peacefully, Mitchell raised his hand. The officer here did something I should have done with you, Inspector. He took time to observe and communicate instead of jumping to conclusions. Dr. Chen smiled. Excellent observation. Let's break down the specific communication techniques used here. As the first day drew to a close, Mitchell felt mentally exhausted but somehow lighter. The defensive wall he built around his actions was beginning to crumble, replaced by a growing understanding of his impact on others. Inspector Thompson addressed the class one final time. Tomorrow, we'll be joined by community members who will share their experiences with law enforcement. These aren't people coming to attack you. They're coming to help build bridges. Listen to them as you would want to be listened to. Packing up his materials, Mitchell noticed a photo that had fallen from Thompson's folder, a younger version of the inspector in his rookie uniform, standing proudly next to his first patrol car. The image made Thompson seem more human, reminding Mitchell that everyone had their own journey. As he walked to his car, Mitchell reflected on the day's lessons. He had expected punishment and humiliation, but instead found something more challenging: the opportunity to confront his own biases and the chance to change. The real test would come tomorrow, facing the community he had helped damage. But for the first time since the court hearing, he felt ready to listen and learn. The second day of training began differently than the first. The classroom had been rearranged into a circle of chairs, creating an intimate setting for what would prove to be an intense day of dialogue. Mitchell arrived early, choosing a seat where he could observe everyone who entered. One by one, community members began filing in. There was Mrs. Jackson, a 68-year-old grandmother who had lived in the precinct for 4 decades. Marcus Young, a successful business owner who had been stopped by police 17 times in the past year. Sarah Rodriguez, a high school teacher, and several others representing different parts of the community. Inspector Thompson started the session with a simple but powerful statement. Today isn't about accusations or defense. Mrs. Jackson spoke first, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've raised 3 generations in this neighborhood. My grandsons, all college graduates, still call me every time they drive home late, so I know they made it safely past police checkpoints." She looked directly at Mitchell. "Do you know what it's like to fear for your children's safety from those meant to protect them?" Mitchell felt the weight of her words. He thought about his own family, how he'd never had to worry about such things. For the first time, he truly began to understand the privilege he'd taken for granted. Marcus Young shared next, describing a recent incident eerily similar to Mitchell's encounter with Thompson. "I was driving my new Mercedes to a client meeting. 3 blocks from my office, I was pulled over. The officer made me sit on the curb while he searched my car, claiming I matched a description. I missed my meeting and lost the client." As each community member shared their stories, Mitchell noticed a pattern. These weren't angry people demanding retribution. They were citizens asking to be seen as human beings, deserving of respect and fair treatment. During the lunch break, Mitchell found himself sitting with Mr. Young. After an awkward moment of silence, Mitchell spoke. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I've been that officer you described, and I was wrong." Young studied him for a moment. "You know what's interesting, Officer Mitchell? The fact that you're here, listening. That's more than most would do." The afternoon session focused on practical solutions. Community members and officers worked together in small groups, discussing how to improve police-community relations. Mitchell found himself engaged in a passionate discussion about traffic stop protocols with Mrs. Jackson and 2 other officers. "What if," Mitchell suggested, surprising himself with his enthusiasm, "we started each month with community coffee meetings? Regular citizens and officers just talking, getting to know each other as people." Inspector Thompson, who had been quietly observing, nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of initiative we need. Building relationships before crises occur." As the day progressed, the invisible wall between the officers and community members began to crumble. Stories were shared, ideas exchanged, and genuine connections formed. Mitchell found himself taking pages of notes, not because he had to, but because he wanted to remember everything. Near the end of the session, Thompson introduced one final speaker, his own teenage son. The young man stood before the group, describing what it felt like to grow up black in a police family, straddling 2 worlds that often seemed at odds. "My dad wears the badge with pride," he said, "but he also taught me how to handle traffic stops safely, just in case the officer who pulls me over doesn't know or care that I'm a cop's kid." Mitchell watched Thompson during his son's speech, seeing both the proud father and the concerned parent. It drove home the reality that this wasn't just about policing. It was about building a community where everyone felt safe and respected. As the day ended, each officer was asked to make a concrete commitment to change. When Mitchell's turn came, he stood confidently. "I commit to being the kind of officer who builds trust rather than fear, and I want to help start those monthly community coffee meetings we discussed." Inspector Thompson closed the session with a reminder. Change doesn't happen in a day, but it does happen one decision at a time. Today, you've all taken important steps toward understanding each other better. Walking to his car that evening, Mitchell heard someone call his name. It was Mrs. Jackson. "Officer Mitchell," she said, "I'll be at that first coffee meeting, and I'm bringing my grandsons. They need to see that change is possible." Mitchell drove home that night feeling different, lighter, yet carrying a new kind of responsibility. He realized that true policing wasn't about power or authority. It was about service and protection for everyone in the community, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. The remaining weeks of Mitchell's sensitivity training passed quickly, each day bringing new insights and challenges. As the program neared its end, Inspector Thompson called Mitchell into his office for a final evaluation before his return to active duty. The office was warm and inviting, with community service awards lining the walls alongside family photos. Thompson gestured for Mitchell to take a seat while reviewing a thick folder on his desk. "Officer Mitchell," Thompson began, "I've been monitoring your progress closely. Your instructors report significant changes in your attitudes and responses during training scenarios. But now comes the real test, putting what you've learned into practice." Mitchell sat straighter in his chair. "I understand, sir. I've been thinking a lot about my return to patrol." "Tell me about your plans for the community coffee meetings," Thompson said, setting aside the folder to give Mitchell his full attention. We'd already secured the community center for the first Saturday of each month. Mitchell responded enthusiastically. Mrs. Jackson has helped spread the word, and 15 officers have volunteered to participate. We're calling it Coffee with Cops, Building Bridges. Thompson nodded approvingly. Good, but remember, these meetings aren't just about coffee and conversation. They're about building trust that's been broken for generations. Mitchell pulled out a small notebook where he'd been keeping ideas. I've also been working with Marcus Yum to develop a business owners advisory council. They'll provide feedback on how our patrol practices affect local businesses. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Officer Rodriguez, Mitchell's former partner, entered with some paperwork. She smiled seeing Mitchell. Ready to hit the streets again, partner? Thompson raised his hand. Actually, there's going to be a change in assignments. He turned to Mitchell. For the next 6 months, you'll be working with our community outreach unit. Officer Rodriguez will be your senior partner, as she's been doing this work successfully for years. Mitchell felt a mixture of surprise and relief. Rodriguez had always shown better judgment in community interactions, and he knew he could learn from her experience. Your first assignment, Thompson continued, starts tomorrow. You'll be speaking to the new recruit class at the academy about your experience and the importance of unbiased policing. Mitchell's stomach tightened. Sir? You want me to? Yes, Thompson interrupted. Your story is powerful precisely because you've been on both sides of this issue. New officers need to hear it. The next morning, Mitchell stood nervously before 30 fresh-faced recruits. Looking out at their eager expressions, he remembered his own time in their seats, thinking he knew everything about being a good police officer. 6 weeks ago, he began, I was the kind of officer who saw threats instead of people. I let bias cloud my judgment and used my badge as a shield for prejudice. He paused, making eye contact with various recruits. Then I pulled over the wrong car, or maybe it was the right car at the right time. For the next hour, Mitchell shared his story, holding nothing back. He described his misconduct, the court hearing, and most importantly, the lessons he learned during his suspension. The recruits listened intently, many taking notes. During the question and answer session, a young recruit raised her hand. Sir, how do we avoid falling into the same patterns you did? Mitchell thought carefully before answering. Remember that every person you interact with is someone's family member. They're not just a traffic stop or a suspect. They're human beings deserving of respect and fair treatment. After the session, Inspector Thompson, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, approached Mitchell. Well done, he said, extending his hand. You've come a long way. Thank you, sir, Mitchell replied, shaking his hand. For everything. Don't thank me yet, Thompson smiled. Tomorrow you start your community patrols with Rodriguez. She's planned a full day of community introductions. As Mitchell left the academy that afternoon, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The past 6 weeks had transformed not just his approach to policing, but his entire worldview. He understood now that true law enforcement wasn't about power or control. It was about service, protection, and building trust. His phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez. Ready for tomorrow, partner. First stop, Mrs. Jackson's neighborhood watch meeting. Mitchell smiled as he typed his response. Ready. Time to put those lessons into practice. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in his career, Mitchell felt truly prepared to serve his community, all of his community, with the respect and fairness they deserved. 6 months had passed since Mitchell's first day back on duty, and the 47th Precinct had transformed in ways few could have predicted. The community coffee meetings had grown from a handful of participants to over 100 regular attendees, requiring a move to a larger venue. On this particular morning, Mitchell stood at the podium in the precinct's main conference room, preparing to give his final probation report to a panel led by Inspector Thompson. The room was filled with fellow officers. Share with us the results of your 6-month community outreach assignment. Mitchell took a deep breath and looked around the room, seeing many familiar faces. Mrs. Jackson beaming proudly from the front row immunity outreach team. When I started this journey, Mitchell began, I thought it was about punishment. I was wrong. It was about transformation, not just for me, but for our entire precinct. He displayed a series of charts showing dramatic decreases in civilian complaints, improved response times, and increased community cooperation in solving crimes. The Business Owners Advisory Council, now 30 members strong, had helped implement new patrol strategies that balance security with community needs. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Mitchell continued. The real change can be seen in our daily interactions. He shared several examples, including how officers now regularly attended community events, not as security, but as participants and neighbors. Mrs. Jackson stood up to share her perspective. 6 months ago, my grandsons were afraid of the police. Last week, they asked about joining the Junior Police Academy program. That's the kind of change we've seen. Marcus Young spoke next, describing how traffic stops in the precinct had become more professional and respectful. Officers now introduce themselves and explain the reason for the stop before asking for documents. It's a small change that makes a big difference. Inspector Thompson listened intently, occasionally making notes. When all the presentations finished, he addressed the room. Officer Mitchell's story could have ended in termination. Instead, it became a catalyst for department-wide improvement. He stood and walked to the podium. Based on the evidence presented and the overwhelming community support, I'm pleased to announce that Officer Mitchell has successfully completed his probation. Furthermore, he's been promoted to lead our expanded community relations unit. The room erupted in applause. Mitchell, caught off guard by the promotion, felt tears welling up in his eyes. Rodriguez was the first to congratulate him, followed by a line of well-wishers from both the department and community. As the crowd began to disperse, Mitchell found himself face to face with Inspector Thompson. "Sir," he said, "I don't know how to thank you." Thompson smiled. "Thank me by continuing this work. Real change takes time and dedication. You've shown both." Later that evening, Mitchell sat in his patrol car, parked in the same spot where he pulled Thompson over all those months ago. He watched as diverse groups of people walked the streets, greeting officers on patrol with waves and smiles instead of fear and suspicion. His radio crackled with a call, a traffic stop in progress. He drove to the scene, where a rookie officer had pulled over a young black man in an expensive car. Mitchell watched proudly as the officer followed the new protocols, respectful, professional, and unbiased. As he prepared to head home, Mitchell received one final text from Inspector Thompson. "Remember where this journey started? Drive by the community center." Curious, Mitchell drove to the center, where he found the parking lot full of cars. Inside, community members and officers were sharing dinner, playing games with local kids, and simply talking like neighbors. Mrs. Jackson approached him with a coffee. "Welcome to our first evening community gathering," she said. "We decided the mornings weren't enough." Mitchell looked around the room, seeing everything he'd worked for these past months. Officers and citizens connecting as people, barriers breaking down, trust being built. He remembered the officer he'd been, seen threats where there were only people, and felt grateful for the journey that had brought him here. As he sipped his coffee and joined a conversation with some local teenagers interested in law enforcement careers, Mitchell realized that his story hadn't just been about personal redemption. It had become something bigger, a template for change, a proof that even the deepest biases could be overcome with commitment, education, and understanding. The precinct would never be perfect, but it had found a better way forward, one cup of coffee, one conversation, one changed mind at a time.